Hey guys, Ravi here. I just finished building my new PC and I'm gonna show you how you can assemble one yourself. But before we get to the actual assembling, I just want to touch upon one thing, that is choosing the components for your build. You want to make sure that all your components are compatible with one another. Just to help out a bit, I am going to leave a few links down in the description to a couple of awesome builds. Moving along, these are the parts that I chose. The B150M Micro ATX motherboard from ASRock, the 3.2 GHz 6500 Skylake Intel processor coupled with 16 GB of DDR4 memory in the form of two 8 GB sticks of Ripjaws from G.Skill. For the graphics, I chose the NVIDIA GTX 1060 from Zotac. For storage, I am using 1 TB WD Blue hard disk coupled with a 32 GB V4 Crucial SSD. Powering all this is the Cooler Master B500 bronze rated power supply. Everything is packed inside this beautiful looking S340 case from NZXT. But regardless of what parts you use, the assembly process will pretty much be the same. Before we put everything into the case, you want to make sure that everything works together flawlessly. Because if you assemble everything and later you discover that something is wrong, it can be a right pain in the ass to take it all apart again. So grab the motherboard box because we will be using that as a makeshift test bench. You might wanna read the user manual, by the way, it has some nice jokes in it. First thing we are gonna put in is the processor. Most of the Intel processors come with a stock heatsink and fan that are actually pretty efficient in keeping the unit nice and cool. But if you plan to overclock, then you might wanna look into some third-party coolers, otherwise this will be sufficient. First thing you wanna do is take off the cover from the CPU socket. This thing prevents the pins from taking any damage. Now look for a small triangle on one of the corners of the CPU bracket, usually lower left, and memorize its position. Now you need to press the retention arm down and pull it away from the hook. Now when you lift the arm, it should bring up the CPU bracket. Take your processor and position it such that the golden triangle is lined up with where the triangle was on the bracket. Now gently place the CPU chip in the socket such that the small indent matches up with the motherboard. Place it, don't press it. Do not put any pressure on the CPU. Wiggle it slightly to make sure that it is secure, then bring the bracket down and push the retention arm back under the hook. It might take a bit of force. That done, now comes the part that is every PC builder's nightmare. Installing the CPU cooler. The stock heatsink already comes with a thermal compound pre-applied, so you don't need to put any more. On top of the cooler, rotate the plastic screws away from the direction the arrow is pointing. Make sure there is enough slack in the fan cable that it can reach the CPU fan header on the motherboard. This header will be clearly marked as CPU fan or something similar. Now position the heatsink over the CPU so that the white plastic heads line up with the 4 holes. Make sure that the cooler is correctly lined up and then press the opposite ends down until you hear a clicking sound. Do this for all 4 sides and confirm that it is indeed fixed by flipping the motherboard and making sure that a small black piece is protruding from within the white plastic. Next up, we are gonna install the RAM. This is quite easy. One side of the RAM slot on the motherboard can be pushed back to release the lock. Now line up the cut in the RAM with the break in the socket. The slot lengths are uneven, so there is only one side the RAM can face to fit in. Now just push in the RAM stick, keeping it parallel with the socket. Push down and the latch on the side should automatically come up and lock it in place. Next, we are going to install the graphics card. This too is very easy to install. The PCI Express slot has a lock on one end which needs to be slided back. Then take the graphics card, carefully line it up with the slot and push down. Then just slide the lock back and you are done. Now to install the SSD, you just need to take a SATA cable and plug one end in the SSD and the other end on the motherboard to the lowest numbered SATA port. Be mindful of which way you put the cable in. I won't be connecting the hard drive for testing, but you can if you really want to. Now all we need to do is power everything up. The power supply will come with a number of connectors. First up is this massive connector which supplies the power to the motherboard. Next is this 8-pin connector which is power for the CPU. Then we have this 6-pin connector which is for your graphics card. Those additional 2 pins are for some cards that require a 8-pin connector. We won't be needing those. Next we have these thin long connectors which are SATA power connectors. We will be using these to power the SSD and the hard drive. Finally, we have the 4-pin Molex connector which has 12 volt and 5 volt connections to power your case fans and LEDs or other peripherals that can't take power from the motherboard. Now just connect a display to one of the ports on your graphic card. Plug in the power supply after making all the connections and switch it on. And nothing happens. That's because we need to tell the motherboard to turn on everything. To do that, we need to simulate the press of a power button. So look for a connection header marked as panel 1. This contains the connections for the power button. Now grab your motherboard user manual and look for the pin diagram of this panel and find out the pin that is marked as power switch, power button or something along those lines. There should also be a ground pin right alongside it marked as G and D. You need to connect these together with a piece of wire or a screwdriver to simulate a button press. And voila! Everything turns on. Make sure that some message pops up on the display and you are good to go. Now all that's left to do is undo everything we did and put it all back together inside the case. PC building is such fun, isn't it? Leaving the CPU with its cooler as well as the RAM on the motherboard, we need to take off all the power connections and the graphics card as well as the SSD. Now take off the side panel of your case and lay it on its side. First of all, we are gonna install the IO port shield that came with the motherboard. You just need to press it from the inside, making sure that it is the right way up. Line up your motherboard with the appropriate holes on the case and make sure that there is a standoff below every screw hole. If not, then you can steal some from the places they are not required and screw them in place. Now line up your motherboard with the standoffs and take the flathead hexagonal screws that came with the motherboard as well as the PC case and screw the motherboard in place. Now you need to take off 2 of the PCI Express IO shields so we can install the graphics card. Make sure that the lock is slided to the right. Push in the graphics card appropriately, lining up the IO ports on the back. Slide on the lock and screw the IO plate securely in place. Next, we are going to install the SSD. Take off the SSD tray, slot in the SSD and screw it from the back with the screws that came with the case. You might want to plug in the SATA cable right now, but it can also be done later. Now slide the tray back in and screw it in place. Installing the hard disk is even easier. Just slide it in place and screw the single screw on the side of the tray. Man, there is a lot of screwing going wrong. Next, to install the power supply, we need to take off this back plate and screw it to the front of the power supply. Then slide the power supply in place and screw the plate in place. In my case, the power supply is upside down because it's gonna take the air from the bottom and push it out from the back. Taking a look at the cables that came with the case, we have the power connection which is going to the jumpers we shorted earlier on to turn on the PC. We have the power LED and the hard disk usage LED. For the LEDs, the red side plugs into the positive and the black cable plugs into the ground. We also have the connections for the front USB ports and the audio and microphone plugs. For the appropriate connection of these, you need to refer to the user manual of the motherboard, but they are also clearly marked on the board itself. Now we just need to make the connections similarly to how we made them on the test bench and then do some cable management. I amend, we need to do a lot of cable management. All that done, you can plug in your power supply, turn it on and it's alive. That is your PC built done. I'm gonna show you how you can install LED lighting into your case in another video. Until then, enjoy your brand spanking new PC and I will see you guys in the next video.